In the rural parishes of central Georgia, there exists a plantation house that local historians refuse to discuss in detail. Records from the estate spanning 1847 to 1851 contain unexplained gaps, entire months missing from ledgers that otherwise meticulously document every bushel of cotton and every purchased nail. 2 women died there within hours of each other under circumstances that prompted the county magistrate to seal his investigation notes for 50 years. When those documents finally surfaced in 1901, someone had carefully excised 12 pages with a razor, leaving only the binding threads. What transpired between Catherine Harwell, the 26-year-old wife of one of Georgia's wealthiest planters, and Deline, the enslaved woman who prepared her meals, represents one of the most carefully buried scandals of the antebellum South. The truth involves not supernatural forces, but something far more dangerous to that society. Genuine feeling where only dominion should have existed. Before we continue with the story of Rosewood Hall and the women whose connection defied every law written and unwritten, I need to ask you something. If you're interested in true stories that history tried to erase, stories that reveal what people were capable of feeling and doing when the world told them such things were impossible, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. And tell me in the comments, what state are you listening from? I want to know how far these buried southern stories are reaching. Now, let me take you back to a place where Spanish moss hung so thick it blocked the sun and where silence could be as deliberate as any conspiracy. The transition from introduction to context happens through those sealed records. Those missing pages and unexplained gaps lead us directly into the world that created them. A world that required such careful concealment. Rosewood Hall stood 7 miles outside Milledgeville, Georgia's capital at the time, far enough from scrutiny, but close enough to maintain the appearance of civilization. Thomas Harwell had built the estate in 1834 using profits from his family's Savannah shipping interests and the labor of 43 enslaved people whose names appeared in his ledgers beside livestock. The main house rose 3 stories with Doric columns that planters considered essential to their image as American aristocrats. Behind the grand facade stretched 200 acres of cotton fields, the kitchen house, the overseer's cottage, the quarters, and all the other structures that made such estates function like small kingdoms unto themselves. Catherine Beaumont had arrived at Rosewood Hall in April 1845 as Thomas Harwell's bride. She was the 3rd daughter of a Charleston merchant family that had money but not quite enough of it. The kind of family that needed their daughters to marry well. At 23, she was considered almost past the ideal age for such arrangements. Thomas, 37 and recently widowed, needed a wife who could manage his household and produce heirs. The marriage made perfect economic and social sense, which in their world meant it required no other justification. What no one anticipated was how poorly Catherine would adapt to isolation. In Charleston, she had been surrounded by sisters, cousins, and the constant social circulation of a port city. Rosewood Hall offered her a dozen enslaved house servants, occasional visits from neighboring plantation wives, and long silent afternoons when Thomas rode out to inspect his fields or traveled to Milledgeville on business. She had been taught to embroider, to plan menus, to manage servants, and to keep her opinions on any serious matter carefully concealed. No one had taught her how to endure loneliness. Deline had been born at Rosewood Hall in 1821, making her 24 years old when Catherine arrived. Her mother, Celia, had been the plantation's head cook until her death from fever in 1843. Deline had learned her mother's skills completely, not just the mechanical preparation of food, but the subtle intelligence required to manage the kitchen. House, to anticipate the needs of the big house, to navigate the dangerous space between Thomas Harwell's demands and the reality of what could be accomplished with available resources. She could butcher a hog, preserve vegetables through winter, create elaborate French-style dishes from memory, and manage the 3 younger enslaved people who worked under her direction. Thomas Harwell valued Deline the way he valued a well-made plow, as property that functioned reliably. He had never sold her because replacing her skill would have cost more than she was worth on the market. This cold calculation had kept her and her younger brother Marcus at Rosewood Hall while others were sold away. She understood that her security depended entirely on remaining useful. The kitchen house stood 30 yards from the main residence, connected by a covered walkway that allowed meals to arrive hot but kept cooking fires safely distant. This separation meant Deline spent her days in a domain that was entirely her own, supervised, but rarely directly observed. She woke before dawn to start fires, worked through the heat of the day, and often didn't finish cleaning until long after the family had retired. It was exhausting, dangerous work. Burns and cuts were constant. But it also provided something rare in slavery, a degree of autonomous space. Catherine's first months at Rosewood Hall followed the expected pattern. She wrote letters to her sisters. She supervised the house servants with the uncertain authority of a new wife. She endured Thomas's attention with the resignation her mother had taught her to consider womanly virtue. But by summer the letters grew less frequent. The August heat pressed down like a physical weight, making even breathing feel like labor. Thomas began taking extended trips to Savannah and Milledgeville, often staying away for weeks. Catherine found herself alone in the great house with only the servants for company, and she discovered that loneliness could actually worsen when surrounded by people who were forbidden from treating her as human rather than mistress. She began visiting the kitchen house more frequently than necessary. At first she told herself she was simply learning to manage the household more efficiently. But the truth was that Deline's domain felt more alive than the formal silent rooms of the main house. The kitchen smelled of rising bread and simmering stocks. It held the heat of the cooking fire even when the rest of the world felt cold, and Deline moved through it with a confidence that Catherine found herself watching perhaps longer than she should. The first conversation that went beyond mistress-servant formality happened in September 1845. Catherine had come to discuss the menu for a dinner party Thomas was hosting for several planters to discuss a proposed railroad line. She found Deline preparing dough for rolls, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, and something about the rhythm of the work, the peaceful concentration, made Catherine linger. "Did your mother teach you?" Catherine asked. And the question itself was already inappropriate. Asking an enslaved person about family, about inheritance, about anything that acknowledged them as a person with history. Deline's hands stilled for just a moment. She was intelligent enough to recognize danger and careful enough to avoid it. "Yes, ma'am," she said quietly. "She taught me everything." Catherine should have left it there. Instead, she asked, "Do you miss her?" The silence that followed lasted long enough that Catherine realized she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She had asked Deline to be human in her presence, to acknowledge grief, to pretend for a moment that the distance between them was not absolute. Deline's expression remained carefully neutral, but something in her eyes suggested she understood the transgression perfectly. "Every day, ma'am," Deline finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. Catherine left the kitchen house quickly, her face flushed, feeling as though she had done something dangerous without quite understanding what. That night, lying beside her sleeping husband, she thought about that moment with an intensity that confused her. She told herself she was simply being kind, taking interest in the people under her care. But kindness didn't explain the way her heart had beaten faster or the way she kept remembering the exact tone of Deline's voice. Over the following months, Catherine's visits to the kitchen house became routine. She would bring needlework and sit near the fire while Deline worked, and slowly, cautiously, they began to talk. Catherine spoke about Charleston, about her sisters, about the book she had read when her father wasn't monitoring her education. Deline, more carefully, spoke about cooking techniques, about the plantation's rhythms, about small safe topics that wouldn't expose her to danger. But gradually, inevitably, the conversations deepened. Catherine confessed her loneliness, her feeling of being trapped in a role she had never wanted, her fear that her entire life would be lived in service to her husband's ambitions and her future son's inheritances. Deline, with the careful intelligence of someone who had survived by reading people perfectly, recognized in Catherine something she had never expected to find in a white woman. Genuine unhappiness with her privilege, a desire for something beyond the prescribed role. What Catherine wanted, Deline slowly realized, was to be known, not as Thomas Harwell's wife, not as a Charleston Beaumont, but as herself, whatever that might be, beneath all the layers of expectation. And in seeking that recognition, Catherine had turned to the one person in her daily life who seemed truly present, truly competent, truly alive in a way that the distant plantation wives and the subservient house servants were not. For Deline, the situation was far more dangerous. She understood that Catherine's attention could destroy her as easily as protect her. Any hint of impropriety, any suggestion that she had failed to maintain proper distance could result in sale, punishment, or worse. She should have maintained absolute boundaries, should have deflected every personal question, should have kept Catherine firmly in the role of mistress. But Deline was also lonely. She had grown up at Rosewood Hall, watching people she loved disappear, sold, dead from disease, escaped and never heard from again. Her brother Marcus worked in the fields and came to the kitchen house exhausted with little energy for conversation. The other enslaved people in the kitchen were younger, less educated, and wary of her because her position gave her a measure of authority over them. She had no peers, no confidants, no one who saw her as anything other than the cook or the master's valuable property. When Catherine looked at her, really looked, with attention and interest, something in Deline responded despite every instinct of self-preservation. She found herself speaking more freely, sharing small details about her thoughts and observations. She made Catherine laugh, and that laughter felt like a small rebellion against the heavy silence of the plantation. By spring of 1846, they had developed a rhythm that both recognized as dangerous, but neither could quite abandon. Catherine would spend hours in the kitchen house, ostensibly supervising, but actually just present, watching Deline work and talking in a way she couldn't with anyone else in her life. Deline would prepare special dishes, small pastries, delicate preparations that she claimed were tests of new recipes, but that both understood as offerings, gifts presented within the only framework available to them. The physical contact began so gradually that neither could have identified the exact moment it changed. Catherine helped reach for ingredients on high shelves. Deline steadied Catherine when she stumbled on the uneven kitchen floor. Their hands touched when passing dishes, lingered when they shouldn't have. Catherine began touching Deline's shoulder. When she laughed, letting her hand rest there just a moment too long. Deline found reasons to stand close, to brush past, to exist in Catherine's space in ways that should have been impossible given their positions. What they were creating slowly, without words, without acknowledgement, was intimacy in a world that insisted such a thing could not exist between them. Catherine had been raised to believe enslaved people were fundamentally different, incapable of the refined feelings that defined white womanhood. Deline had been raised to believe white people were fundamentally dangerous, incapable of seeing enslaved people as fully human. Both were discovering that everything they had been taught was a lie designed to sustain a system that benefited from that lie. The first kiss happened in late May 1846. Thomas had been in Savannah for 2 weeks. A thunderstorm had rolled across the plantation, one of those violent spring storms that turned the sky green and sent everyone running for cover. Catherine had been in the kitchen house when the rain started, and rather than run back to the main house through the downpour, she had stayed. They stood together near the window, watching the rain sheet across the yard, and the electricity in the air seemed to extend to the space between them. Catherine turned to Deline, and something in her expression made clear what she wanted. Deline should have stepped back, should have remembered every lesson about survival, should have recognized this as the moment that could destroy her. Instead, she leaned forward and touched her lips to Catherine's with a gentleness that acknowledged both the desire and the impossibility. The kiss lasted only seconds before they pulled apart. Both terrified, both exhilarated, they stared at each other in the dim light of the storm-darkened kitchen, and the weight of what they had just done settled over them like a physical presence. This was not just forbidden, it was unthinkable. It crossed every boundary their world recognized. It was illegal in ways that went beyond written law into the realm of social death. "We can't," Deline whispered, and her voice carried all the fear of someone who understood exactly how much she had to lose. "I know," Catherine said, and she was crying, tears running down her face to mix with the rain that had blown in through the open window. "I know, but I don't care. I don't care anymore." But Deline did care, because she had to. Catherine's ruin would mean scandal, shame, perhaps divorce. Deline's ruin would mean the auction block, the whip, possibly death. The consequences were not equal, had never been equal, could never be equal within the system they inhabited. They should have stopped there. Any rational calculation of risk should have ended it. But loneliness and desire are not rational. And the next time Thomas left for Savannah, Catherine came to the kitchen house after dark, when the other servants had gone to the quarters, when only Deline remained to bank the fires and prepare for morning. This time the kiss was not tentative. This time they did not pull apart after seconds. What followed over the next months defied every structure that governed their lives. They developed elaborate deceptions to create moments alone. Catherine claimed she needed to learn cooking for household management. She sent the other kitchen workers on errands. She began taking meals in the kitchen house rather than the dining room. The house servants noticed but said nothing. They understood that white people's business was dangerous to observe and that Catherine's favor toward Deline protected them all from closer scrutiny. Thomas, when he was present, noticed only that his wife seemed less melancholic, that the household ran smoothly, that the meals continued to be excellent. He was pleased that Catherine had adjusted to plantation life. The idea that his wife and his property were conducting a relationship that made a mockery of everything he believed about social order never crossed his mind, because such things were literally unthinkable within his worldview. What Catherine and Deline built in those stolen moments was as real as anything can be under such circumstances. They talked for hours, shared every thought, learned each other with an intensity that came from knowing discovery meant destruction. Catherine brought books to the kitchen house and read aloud while Deline worked. Poetry, novels, anything that created a world beyond Rosewood Hall. Deline taught Catherine to bake bread, to judge meat by touch, to do practical things with her hands that her Charleston education had never included. In those moments, the roles of mistress and slave dissolved into something more fundamental. But the reality of their situation never truly disappeared. Catherine could convince herself that what they shared was a relationship between equals, but Deline never had that luxury. She was always aware that Catherine could, with a word, have her sold or punished. She was always aware that her brother's safety depended on Thomas Harwell's satisfaction. She was always aware that their intimacy existed only because she was skilled enough at managing the kitchen that her absences and distractions weren't noticed. She was always aware that she was risking everything, her life, her brother's life, the fragile security that came from being valuable property, for something that could never have a future. The first person to notice something was wrong was Marcus, Deline's younger brother. He came to the kitchen house one evening in August 1846 and found his sister staring into the fire with an expression he had never seen before, something between joy and terror. He asked her directly what was happening. And Deline, who had never lied to her brother, told him the truth. Marcus's reaction was pure fear. "She's going to get you killed," he said flatly. "She's going to get us both killed. Whatever she's promised you, whatever she's made you feel, it doesn't matter. She's white and you're not, and that's the only thing that matters when this ends." Deline knew he was right. Knew it. But she was also 25 years old and had never felt anything like what she felt when Catherine looked at her with eyes that saw her as a person rather than property. She had never imagined that such recognition was possible. And now that she had experienced it, the thought of returning to the previous emptiness felt unbearable. "Maybe it won't end," she said quietly, knowing even as she spoke that it was a lie. "It always ends," Marcus said. "You know that. Everything we care about, they take it away. That's what they do." He was speaking from experience. Their mother had been taken by fever. Their older sister had been sold south when Marcus was 10. Their father had been a man from a neighboring plantation who had been sold before Marcus was born. They had both learned that attachment meant loss, that love in slavery was just another way to suffer. But knowing something intellectually and being able to act on that knowledge are different things. Deline continued seeing Catherine, continued building something that had no name in their language, no legal existence, no possible future. They became more careless, more desperate. Catherine began coming to the kitchen house late at night after Thomas was asleep. They stayed together until just before dawn when Deline would have to begin preparations for breakfast. They existed in those stolen hours as if the morning would never come, as if the world beyond the kitchen house walls had ceased to exist. The change in Catherine was visible to anyone who cared to look. She moved differently, spoke differently, smiled in moments when she should have been properly solemn. The neighboring plantation wives, when they visited, commented to each other about how much happier Catherine seemed, how marriage must be agreeing with her. Thomas, on the rare occasions he was home and attentive, assumed his wife's improved mood reflected her adjustment to her proper role. No one suspected the truth, because the truth was, by definition, impossible. White women did not feel desire for enslaved women. Enslaved women had no desires beyond survival. These were facts as fundamental as the sun rising in the east. To question them was to question the entire structure of society. But impossible things happen every day. And by fall of 1846, what Catherine and Deline felt for each other had developed into something that both recognized as love. Though neither could safely speak that word aloud, they made plans that couldn't work. Fantasies of escape north, of somehow buying Deline's freedom, of running away together to where no one knew them. These plans were delusional, but delusion becomes attractive when reality offers nothing. The beginning of the end came in November 1846 when Thomas Harwell's unmarried sister Judith came to stay at Rosewood Hall. Judith was 42, sharp-eyed and bitter about her dependent status in her brother's household. She had been raised to manage a plantation, but would never own one. Trained to command servants, but denied the ultimate authority. She compensated by being extremely attentive to any disruption in proper order. Judith noticed immediately that something was wrong. She noticed how often Catherine visited the kitchen house. She noticed how Deline's expression changed when Catherine entered. She noticed the small unconscious gestures of intimacy, how Catherine touched Deline's arm in passing, how Deline smiled at something Catherine said. Individually, these observations meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. Judith had lived in the South her entire life. She understood the hidden architecture of plantation households, the secret relationships that white men conducted with enslaved women, the way power and intimacy could twist into forms that society officially denied. What she observed between Catherine and Deline wasn't quite that, but it was something, and something was enough to be dangerous. She began watching more carefully. She started appearing in the kitchen house unexpectedly, started asking pointed questions about Catherine's schedule, started creating situations designed to reveal what she suspected. Catherine, who had been raised to navigate social surveillance, should have recognized the danger, but she had become so accustomed to the kitchen house as a safe space that she failed to adjust her behavior appropriately. The discovery happened on a cold December night. Judith woke past midnight and noticed lights still burning in the kitchen house. She dressed and walked across the yard, telling herself she was investigating what might be a fire hazard. What she found when she opened the kitchen house door was Catherine and Deline standing close together, Catherine's hand on Deline's face in a gesture that was unmistakably intimate. The three women froze in a tableau that seemed to last forever. Judith's expression moved from confusion to comprehension to absolute horror. Catherine stepped back from Deline as if burned, her face going white. Deline dropped her eyes immediately to the floor, every survival instinct screaming at her to appear as deferential and non-threatening as possible. "Judith," Catherine started, her voice shaking. "It's not, it's exactly what it appears to be," Judith said, and her voice was cold and precise. "You disgrace yourself. You disgrace this family, and you contaminate this household with this perversion." The word hung in the air like poison. Perversion. Not love, not relationship, not connection. Perversion, the word that erased everything real and replaced it with sin. "Please," Catherine whispered. "Please don't tell Thomas." Judith looked at her sister-in-law with something close to pity, though pity mixed with contempt. "What you've done gives me no choice. This is not some minor indiscretion. This is. I don't even have words for what this is. Thomas must know. The servants must be disciplined for allowing this. That creature," she gestured at Deline, without looking at her, "must be removed from this property immediately." "No," Catherine said, and the desperation in her voice revealed everything Judith suspected and more. "No, you can't. Please, I'll do anything." You'll do nothing," Judith said sharply. "You have no authority here. You are Thomas's wife, and when he learns what you've done with his property, you may not even be that for long. I will speak with him tomorrow morning." But Judith didn't leave immediately. She stood in the doorway of the kitchen house, studying the two women before her with the fascinated horror of someone witnessing something she had been taught was impossible. Her eyes moved from Catherine's tear-stained face to Deline's rigidly controlled posture, and a new understanding seemed to dawn. "How long?" Judith asked quietly, and the question carried more weight than her previous anger. "How long has this contamination existed in my brother's house?" Catherine opened her mouth, but no words came. It was Deline who spoke, her voice barely audible, her eyes still fixed on the floor. "It's my fault, ma'am. I took advantage of Mrs. Harwell's kindness. I deceived her. She's innocent in this." "Don't," Catherine said sharply, finding her voice. "Don't lie for me, Deline. Judith, whatever you think of me, whatever Thomas will do to me, I won't let Deline take blame that isn't hers. This was both of us. I wanted," her voice broke. "I wanted this as much as she did." Judith's expression shifted from horror to something more complex, a mixture of disgust and genuine confusion. In her world, such desire between women was theoretically possible, but considered a temporary aberration, something that occurred in the absence of proper male guidance and that evaporated once that guidance was restored. But what she was witnessing suggested something far more substantial. Catherine wasn't speaking like a woman who had been corrupted or deceived. She was speaking like a woman defending someone she loved. You're telling me, Judith said slowly, that you chose this, that you, a white woman of good family, deliberately sought intimacy with a slave. Yes, Catherine said, and despite her terror, there was defiance in her voice. I chose it. I choose her. I know you can't understand that, but it's the truth. Judith shook her head, not in disbelief, but in a kind of appalled wonder. Then you're more lost than I imagined. Thomas will have the marriage annulled if he can manage it. You'll return to Charleston in absolute disgrace. And that thing, she looked at Deline properly for the first time, will be sold so far south she'll never contaminate another household. She has a name, Catherine said, her voice gaining strength even as tears continued to run down her face. Her name is Deline. She's a person. She feels, she thinks, she is property, Judith interrupted with brutal finality. And you have allowed yourself to forget that distinction, with consequences that will destroy you both. I almost pity you, Catherine. You've thrown away everything, your position, your reputation, your future, for something that was never real and could never last. It was real, Catherine said quietly. Whatever happens now, whatever you tell Thomas, whatever he does to us, it was real. What we felt for each other was real. Judith turned and left, her footsteps echoing across the frozen yard as she returned to the main house. The door closing behind her sounded like a judge's gavel, final and absolute. Catherine and Deline stood in the kitchen house that had been their sanctuary, and both understood this was the end of everything. As soon as they were alone, Catherine reached for Deline. But Deline stepped back, creating distance that felt like a physical wound. Don't, Deline said, and her voice was flat, drained of all emotion. It's over. It has to be over. Maybe we can still, if we say. Nothing happened, if we deny everything. She saw us, Catherine said, and she was crying again, the tears coming so fast she could barely speak. She saw us and she'll tell Thomas and Hill, oh God, what will he do to you? That was the question that mattered. Thomas Harwell owned Deline completely. He could have her whipped, sold, even killed if he determined she had violated his property rights by contaminating his wife. The law was entirely on his side. Enslaved people had no legal recourse, no rights, no protection from anything an owner chose to do. You need to go, Deline said quietly. You need to go back to the house and we need to never speak of this again. Tell them I deceived you. Tell them I took advantage of your kindness. Tell them whatever you need to tell them to protect yourself. I won't lie about you, Catherine said. I won't let them hurt you. Deline looked at Catherine with an expression that held both love and absolute clarity about their situation. You can't stop them, she said. You never could. That's what I've been trying to make you understand. We were always living on borrowed time, and now the time is up. Catherine wanted to argue, wanted to insist that she could protect Deline, that her position as Thomas's wife gave her some authority. But Deline's expression told her the truth. White women had no power in this system except what men allowed them. And that power evaporated the moment they violated the rules that sustained their privilege. They stood facing each other in the kitchen house that had been their sanctuary and both understood this was goodbye. Catherine reached out once more, and this time Deline let Catherine take her hand and hold it for a few seconds that had to contain everything they couldn't say. I love you, Catherine whispered. Whatever happens, know that I love you. Deline nodded, not trusting her voice, and then gently pulled her hand away. Go, she said. Please, just go. Catherine left, walking back across the dark yard to the main house where everything was about to collapse. Deline stood alone in the kitchen house, staring at the dying fire, and understood with perfect clarity that her life was over. Either she would be sold away, separated from her brother and everything she knew, or worse things would happen. The best she could hope for was that Marcus would be spared, that whatever punishment came would fall only on her. She thought about running. There were networks, people who helped fugitives reach the north. But running meant abandoning Marcus, meant making herself a criminal, meant living as prey for the rest of her life. And part of her, the part that was too tired and too heartbroken to keep fighting, wondered if running was even worth it. Morning came too quickly. Deline went through the motions of preparing breakfast, her hands moving automatically through tasks she had performed thousands of times. The other kitchen workers knew something was wrong, but were too frightened to ask. Fear spread quickly in slave quarters. Everyone knew that when trouble came to one, it could spread to all. Thomas Harwell learned everything over breakfast. Judith told him with clinical precision, sparing no detail. She described what she had seen, what she suspected had been happening for months, and what needed to be done to restore order and propriety to the household. Thomas's reaction was not immediate rage, but something colder and more dangerous, a sense of his authority being fundamentally challenged. His wife had betrayed him with his property. The natural order had been inverted. What he had believed was his control had revealed itself as chaotic and ungovernable. This was not just personal insult, but a threat to everything he understood about the world. He sent for Catherine first. She came to his study, her face pale, her hands trembling. He did not invite her to sit. "Is what my sister described true?" he asked, and his voice was terrifyingly calm. Catherine understood that lying was pointless. "Yes," she said quietly. "And how long has this contamination existed in my household?" "Since last spring," Catherine said. "Thomas, you will not speak," he interrupted. "You will listen. What you have done is not only disgusting, but illegal. You have degraded yourself with an animal. You have made my household a site of perversion. You have humiliated me before my family and, should this become public, before my entire social circle." "She's not an animal," Catherine said, and even terrified, even understanding she had no power, she couldn't let that pass unchallenged. "She's a person, and Thomas struck her, not violently enough to injure seriously, but hard enough to assert absolute authority." Catherine staggered back, holding her face, and Thomas pointed at her with a rigid finger. "You will never speak of this again," he said. "You will remain in this house. You will see no one. You will correspond with no one. I will decide later what is to be done with you. But for now, you will be confined to your room, and you will thank God that I don't exercise my legal right to divorce you for this abomination and send you back to your family in absolute disgrace." He called for a house servant to escort Catherine to her room. Then he sent for his overseer, a man named Hadley, who had managed Rosewood Hall's field operations for 12 years with efficient brutality. "The cook, Deline," Thomas said. "She has contaminated my household with her influence over my wife. She must be sold immediately. I want her off this property by tomorrow." Hadley nodded. This was familiar territory. Disobedient property being removed. "I'll contact the dealers in Milledgeville. Won't get top price on such short notice." "But I don't care about price," Thomas said. "I want her sold south, deep south, somewhere she will never have opportunity to spread her corruption or to maintain any connection to this place. Make it clear to the dealers that this is essential." Being sold south meant the sugar plantations of Louisiana, the cotton fields of Mississippi, the rice swamps of South Carolina, places where enslaved people died quickly and were easily replaced. It was understood as one of the worst fates possible within slavery, a death sentence that left the body alive long enough to suffer. "And her brother?" Hadley asked. "Marcus. He's one of your field hands." Thomas considered. "Keep him for now. He's productive, but make clear to him that his sister's disgrace has been noted, and any disruption from him will result in immediate sale." Deline learned her fate that afternoon. Hadley came to the kitchen house and told her, with the casual tone of someone conveying routine information, she would be sold tomorrow morning. She had until dawn to prepare herself and say goodbye to anyone she needed to say goodbye to. Deline's first thought was of Marcus. She found him in the fields during the brief evening break and told him what was happening. Her brother, who had predicted exactly this outcome, took her hands and pressed his forehead to hers. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." "Don't," he said fiercely. "Don't apologize for being human. Don't apologize for wanting something for yourself. This isn't your fault. It's theirs. It's this whole cursed system. Take care of yourself," she said. "Be careful. Don't do anything that gives them reason to hurt you." "I'll find you," Marcus said. "Somehow, someday, I'll find you." They both knew this was a lie, a comfort that couldn't survive reality. Once enslaved people were sold south, they disappeared as completely as if they had died. The distances were too great, the documentation too sparse, the system too deliberately designed to prevent families from ever reconnecting. They held each other until the overseer's bell rang, calling everyone back to work. Then Marcus returned to the fields and Deline returned to the kitchen house for what would be her last night there. She thought about trying to see Catherine, about trying to say goodbye, but she knew it was impossible. Catherine was confined to her room, guarded to prevent exactly that kind of contact. Whatever final words they might have shared would remain unspoken. Instead, Deline sat in the kitchen house she had managed for 4 years, surrounded by the tools of her trade, and tried to prepare herself for what came next. She had heard stories about the Deep South plantations, everyone had. The work was harder, the conditions worse, the death rate higher. Enslaved people were worked to death and replaced from the steady stream of new purchases. She was being sent there not just to be sold, but to be destroyed slowly and systematically. She could run. She had until dawn. The nights were long in December, and she knew the plantations lay out perfectly. She could be miles away before anyone noticed. But running meant abandoning Marcus to potential retaliation. Meant becoming a fugitive with no resources and no connections. Meant gambling everything on a nearly impossible journey north. She sat with that choice for hours, weighing an almost certain terrible death against a small chance at freedom. Many enslaved people had made the same calculation. Some ran and were caught and suffered fates worse than anything legal sale could produce. Some ran and succeeded and became legends whispered in slave quarters. Some, like Deline, sat in the darkness and couldn't decide which form of courage, running or enduring, required more strength. What ultimately kept her from running was the knowledge that if she fled, Thomas Harwell would take his revenge on Marcus. He had already made that clear. Her brother's safety depended on her accepting her punishment without resistance. This was how the system functioned, using people's love for each other as chains, more effective than any iron. Near midnight, something unexpected happened. The kitchen house door opened quietly and Catherine slipped inside. She had managed to bribe a house servant, had climbed out her window and crossed the yard in darkness. She looked terrified and desperate and absolutely determined. "I had to see you," she said. "I couldn't let you go without." Deline stood and crossed to her, and they held each other with the intensity of people who know they will never touch again. No words were adequate. They had both known from the beginning that this couldn't last, that the world they lived in would eventually destroy what they had built. Knowing it didn't make it hurt less. "Come with me," Catherine whispered desperately. "We'll run together. We'll go north." "We'll, you know I can't," Deline said gently. "If I run, Marcus suffers. And you, Catherine, you're white. You have options I'll never have. You can survive this. You can eventually leave Thomas, go back to your family, start over somehow." "I don't want to survive without you," Catherine said, and she was crying, her tears soaking into Deline's shoulder. "You have to," Deline said, "because one of us surviving is better than both of us destroyed. Promise me you'll survive this. Promise me you'll find some way to live." Catherine pulled back and looked at Deline's face, memorizing it, trying to hold on to something that could never be preserved. "I love you," she said. "I will always love you. Nothing they do, nothing they say, nothing that happens will ever change that." "I know," Deline said. "I love you, too. That's why you have to go back to the house now before anyone notices you're gone. That's why we have to let this end." They kissed one last time, and it was gentle and desperate and absolutely final. Then Deline physically turned Catherine toward the door and pushed her gently toward it. "Go," she said. "Please, if you love me, go." Catherine went, looking back once from the doorway, and then she was gone into the darkness. Deline stood alone in the kitchen house and allowed herself for the first time to fully acknowledge her grief. She had lost everything, her home, her brother, her love, her future. All that remained was the certainty of suffering ahead. Dawn came with terrible clarity. A slave dealer from Milledgeville arrived with chains and paperwork. Deline was given no time to gather belongings because enslaved people owned nothing. She was simply property being transferred from one owner to another. The dealer chained her wrists, unnecessary since she wasn't resisting, but required by procedure, and led her to his wagon. Marcus was there, having been given permission to say goodbye. He embraced his sister, and Deline felt his tears on her cheek. "Be strong," she whispered to him. "Survive. That's all we can do. Survive and remember each other." "I won't forget you," Marcus said. "I swear I won't forget." The dealer pulled Deline away and helped her into the wagon with a businesslike efficiency that demonstrated how routine this was for him. He had transported thousands of enslaved people, had seen thousands of these goodbyes. They meant nothing to him because in his world these were not people but merchandise that sometimes inconveniently had feelings. As the wagon pulled away from Rosewood Hall, Deline looked back once. She saw the kitchen house where she had spent the happiest and worst year of her life. She saw Marcus standing in the yard. She saw in an upper window of the main house a pale face that she knew was Catherine watching her leave. Then the wagon turned onto the road and Rosewood Hall disappeared from view. Deline faced forward and tried to prepare herself for whatever came next. She had been sold south. She would probably die there, but she had lived for a brief time as something more than property. She had loved and been loved in return. In a system designed to reduce people to objects, she and Catherine had created something undeniably human. Whether that was worth the price she was about to pay, she didn't know. But it was too late for such questions. The choice had been made. The consequences were unfolding, and all that remained was endurance. The journey to Savannah took 3 days. Deline traveled in the dealer's wagon with 4 other enslaved people, 2 men and a woman with a small child, all of whom had been purchased from various estates for resale in the Deep South markets. The dealer, a man named Crenshaw who had been transporting human cargo for 15 years, maintained professional efficiency. He fed them enough to keep them healthy for sale, chained them securely enough to prevent escape but not so tightly as to leave visible marks that might reduce value, and spoke to them in the tone one might use with livestock. During those 3 days, Deline existed in a strange state between grief and numbness. Everything she had known, her home, her brother, the woman she loved, receded behind her with every mile. The other captives in the wagon spoke little, each absorbed in their own devastation. The woman with the child sang quietly, sometimes old songs that Deline recognized from her mother, songs that had traveled from Africa to America in the holds of slave ships, and that persisted because people needed something beautiful to hold on to in the midst of absolute powerlessness. At the Savannah auction house, Deline was processed like merchandise. Dealers examined her teeth, her hands, asked questions about her skills and health history. Crenshaw, who had her documentation from Thomas Harwell, emphasized her cooking abilities, her literacy, unusual and valuable, and her proven reliability. He mentioned nothing about why she was being sold, though experienced dealers could usually guess. Sudden sales of valuable domestic slaves often indicated some transgression, theft, insolence, or other disruption to household order. Deline was purchased within 2 days by a dealer named Simmons, who specialized in supplying Louisiana sugar plantations. The price was $750, less than her actual value, but Crenshaw had been instructed to sell quickly rather than wait for optimal prices. Simmons chained 15 people together and began the journey west, moving by steamboat up the Savannah River, then overland to Montgomery, then by boat again down to Mobile and New Orleans. The journey took weeks. People died. 1 man from fever, 1 woman in childbirth aboard the steamboat. Their bodies were disposed of with minimal ceremony, and the chain line moved on. Deline watched and understood that this was her future. A world where death was common enough to be unremarkable, where people vanished without record or memorial, where the only thing that mattered was whether enough laborers survived to make the journey profitable. Meanwhile, at Rosewood Hall, events unfolded with their own terrible inevitability. Thomas locked Catherine in her room as he had promised. But over the following days, he struggled with a problem that challenged his understanding of proper action. Divorce required public proceedings and public explanations. To divorce Catherine, he would have to document her transgression. And documenting it meant admitting that his authority had been so thoroughly undermined in his own household. It meant acknowledging that his wife had chosen intimacy with an enslaved woman over her duties to him. The humiliation would be absolute and public. But keeping Catherine created its own problems. She was openly defiant, refusing to express remorse or to pretend the relationship had been anything other than genuine. When Thomas demanded she acknowledge her sin and beg forgiveness, Catherine looked at him with eyes that held no fear, only exhausted contempt. "You want me to say I was deceived," she said quietly during one of his visits to her locked room. "You want me to say Deline corrupted me, that I was an innocent victim? I won't give you that lie. I loved her. I chose her. And I would choose her again, even knowing how this would end." Her honesty was almost incomprehensible to Thomas. In his experience, women might commit indiscretions, but they always had the grace to pretend remorse, to participate in the fiction that allowed society to function. Catherine's refusal to do so made her more dangerous than a simple adulteress. She was challenging the fundamental order, insisting that an enslaved person was worthy of love, that such love was real and defensible. Thomas consulted with his sister Judith and with 2 neighboring planters whose discretion he trusted. All agreed that public divorce would damage him more than Catherine. Instead, they counseled isolation. Keep Catherine confined, limit her contact with the outside world, and eventually the scandal would fade into rumor. In a few years, if Catherine could be brought to show appropriate contrition, some limited social rehabilitation might be possible. But Catherine had no intention of rehabilitation. 3 days after Deline was sold, she began refusing food. Not dramatically, not with announced intention, but simply pushing away plates and saying she wasn't hungry. By the 5th day, Thomas noticed and sent the household's physician to examine her. Dr. Mercer found Catherine physically healthy but displaying what he delicately termed melancholia of severe character. He recommended forced feeding if she continued to refuse nourishment, but also suggested that such extreme measures might not be successful if the patient was determined. Catherine was indeed determined. She had discovered that the only power she retained was the power to refuse. Refuse food, refuse contrition, refuse to continue living in a world that had destroyed the one thing she valued. It was a slow form of suicide, and she pursued it with the same intensity she had once pursued Deline's love. By the 2nd week, she was visibly weakened. The house servants whispered about her condition, and word reached Marcus in the fields. He requested permission to see Mrs. Harwell, ostensibly to apologize for his sister's corruption of her, and Thomas, thinking this might shame Catherine into proper behavior, allowed it. Marcus was brought to Catherine's room under supervision. He found her sitting by the window, thin and pale, staring out at the kitchen house where everything had happened. When she saw Marcus, her expression crumbled. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I tried to protect her and I failed. I failed you both." Marcus, who had every reason to hate this white woman whose selfish desire had destroyed his sister, looked at Catherine and saw only shared grief. "She loved you," he said quietly. "Whatever happens to either of us, you need to know that she loved you, and she never regretted loving you, even knowing it would end this way." "How do you know?" Catherine asked desperately. "How can you know that?" "Because I'm her brother," Marcus said. "Because I knew her better than anyone except maybe you. And because the night before they took her, she told me that knowing you, really knowing you, was worth whatever came after." Those words, meant as comfort, broke something in Catherine. She had been holding on to the possibility that she had ruined Deline's life for nothing. That Deline might regret their relationship, might wish it had never happened. Learning that Deline had considered it worthwhile made the loss unbearable rather than easier to bear. After Marcus left, Catherine wrote 2 letters. One was to her sister in Charleston, describing what had happened and asking forgiveness for the disgrace she had brought on the family. The other was to Deline, though Catherine knew the letter would never be delivered. Enslaved people sold south rarely received correspondence, and even if someone tried to send it, there was no way to trace where Deline had ended up. In the letter to Deline, Catherine wrote everything she hadn't been able to say in their last moments together. She wrote about the impossibility of continuing in a world that insisted their love had never been real. She wrote about her certainty that what they had shared was more genuine than any sanctioned relationship she might have had. She wrote about her choice, because it was a choice, to follow Deline into whatever came after this life rather than spend decades living in the shell of the woman Thomas wanted her to become. She sealed both letters and hid them behind a loose board in her room, knowing they would eventually be found, knowing they would serve as testament when there were no other witnesses. That night, Catherine took the laudanum that Dr. Mercer had prescribed for her distress. She had been saving doses for days, accumulating enough to ensure the outcome she desired. She swallowed the bitter liquid methodically, all of it, and then lay down on her bed to wait. The house servants found her the next morning. She was already cold, already beyond any intervention. Her face held an expression that those who saw it described as peaceful, the first peace she had known since Deline's sale. Thomas Harwell, confronted with a dead wife and a scandal that had to be contained, chose to bury everything. Catherine's body, the truth about what had happened, his own humiliation. Divorce would have required public proceedings and public explanations. Catherine's death, attributed to illness, allowed him to maintain the fiction that nothing untoward had occurred. He destroyed any letters Catherine had written, any journals she had kept, anything that might have documented her relationship with Deline. Within a month, he had courtship negotiations underway with another Charleston merchant's daughter. Within 6 months, he had remarried. Life at Rosewood Hall continued as if Catherine had never existed. But Marcus knew the truth. He had spoken with house servants who had seen Catherine's final moments, who had heard her speaking Deline's name as the poison took effect. He knew his sister had been sent south to die slowly, and he knew that Catherine had chosen to die rather than survive without her. The knowledge broke something in Marcus. He had endured slavery by believing that survival was itself a form of resistance, that staying alive was a way of refusing to let the system win completely. But watching his sister sold away, watching the woman she loved choose death, made survival feel like collaboration. Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror at Rosewood Hall intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. 3 weeks after Catherine's death, Marcus ran. He disappeared from Rosewood Hall in the middle of the night and was never seen again. Thomas Harwell hired slave catchers, posted notices, offered rewards, but Marcus had simply vanished. Whether he made it north, whether he died in the attempt, whether he was caught and killed so far from Rosewood Hall that word never made it back, no one knows. The records show only that in February 1847, Thomas Harwell filed paperwork recording a financial loss due to a fugitive slave valued at $800. That single line in a ledger is the only official acknowledgement that Marcus ever existed. As for Deline, she disappears from the historical record entirely after a sale in December 1846. The Savannah auction house records show her being sold to a dealer who supplied plantations in Louisiana. After that, there is nothing. She could have died on the journey south. She could have died in the first year on a sugar plantation, as many did. She could have survived for decades. There is no way to know. But in the Louisiana plantation records that survive, there are occasional hints of women who resisted in small ways, who poisoned overseers' food, who taught others to read despite prohibitions, who maintained dignity despite every effort to destroy it. Perhaps Deline was one of these women. Perhaps she carried what Catherine had given her, the knowledge that she was fully human, fully capable of love and being loved, into a system designed to deny that truth. Perhaps that knowledge was itself a form of resistance, a refusal to internalize the lies slavery required. The truth is, we don't know. The historical record is silent because the people who kept records didn't consider enslaved people's inner lives worth documenting. They recorded purchases, sales, births that added to property value, deaths that represented financial losses. They did not record love, grief, resistance, or hope because acknowledging those things would have required acknowledging humanity. What we can know is this. Something happened at Rosewood Hall between Catherine Harwell and the enslaved woman Deline that was powerful enough to lead to 2 deaths and a disappearance. Something happened that required elaborate cover-ups, sealed records, and pages cut from official documents. Something happened that historians still find uncomfortable to discuss openly. That something was love, forbidden, impossible, doomed, but undeniably real. And the fact that such love could exist under slavery, that it could drive people to choose death over separation, tells us more about the human capacity for connection than any philosophical argument ever could. Thomas Harwell lived another 30 years. He never spoke of his first wife, Catherine. He raised children with his second wife, managed Rosewood Hall through the Civil War, and died in 1876, financially ruined by abolition but still maintaining the social position that had always defined his identity. Judith Harwell never married. She lived at Rosewood Hall until her death in 1868, managing the household with rigid efficiency, ensuring that propriety was maintained and that no whisper of scandal ever threatened the family name again. The kitchen house still stands at Rosewood Hall, though the plantation itself is now a historical site, one of dozens that dot the southern landscape as monuments to a past that Americans struggle to honestly confront. Tour guides discuss the architecture, the agricultural practices, the role of plantations in the economy. They rarely discuss the lives of the enslaved people who made those plantations function. And they never discuss what happened between Catherine Harwell and Deline in the winter of 1846. But if you visit Rosewood Hall on a quiet day, if you stand in the kitchen house and let yourself imagine the lives lived there, you might understand why some truths get buried. You might understand why a system built on denying humanity had to destroy any evidence that humanity persisted despite that denial. Catherine and Deline's story matters not because it was unique, though the specifics were unusual, but because it reveals the lie at the heart of slavery. The system required white Southerners to believe that enslaved people were fundamentally different, incapable of the refined feelings that define true humanity. But Catherine, raised in that system, taught those beliefs from childhood, discovered they were lies. She fell in love with someone she was supposed to regard as property, and that love was as real and as powerful as any love has ever been. The fact that such love was possible under slavery, that it happened despite every prohibition and every danger, tells us something essential about human nature. We are capable of recognizing each other across any barrier. We are capable of love even when love requires us to destroy ourselves. We are capable of choosing connection over safety, feeling over survival, humanity over the roles society insists we inhabit. This is why Catherine and Deline's story had to be buried. Because acknowledging that such love existed required acknowledging that slavery was not just economically cruel, but philosophically incoherent. You cannot love someone as property. You cannot recognize someone's full humanity and still enslave them. The two positions are absolutely incompatible. Catherine and Deline discovered that incompatibility and paid for that discovery with their lives. They loved each other in a world that insisted such love was impossible. And when that world could no longer ignore what they had created, it destroyed them with brutal efficiency. But it couldn't destroy the truth of what had existed between them. That truth survived in whispered stories, in sealed records, in pages cut from official documents. It survived because truth has a way of persisting even when people try desperately to erase it. This mystery shows us that the most dangerous thing to an unjust system is not rebellion or violence, but simply insisting on loving each other despite being told such love is impossible. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries. See you in the next video.